Welcome to Testify. Today we take a look at the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Chronicles was originally written as one story. It came right after the books of Samuel and Kings. However, most of Chronicles repeats the content of those books, and so many people start reading and think, "Wait, I just read all of this!" And they end up skipping it. That's a shame because this is a really unique and important book in the Old Testament, with a very intentional message. Let's get into it. The author of Chronicles is unknown, but it is somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. 1 Chronicles chapter 1-9, Genealogies of Kings and Priests. 1 Chronicles chapter 1-9 begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names and family lines. You may find this monotonous and boring, but through them, the author is summarizing the entire Old Testament storyline by naming all the key characters. 1 Chronicles chapter 10-29. King David as the messianic ideal. From here, we move into stories about David, and while most of these will be familiar from reading the book of Samuel, there are some very important differences. First of all, the author leaves out all the negative stories, in which David is portrayed as weak or immoral. We are left only with the stories that portray him as a good guy. There is also new material that shows David in a very positive light. There's a large block of chapters, in which David makes preparations for the first temple, arranging for builders, Levites, and choirs. The author even goes so far as to portray David as a figure like Moses. God gives David the plans for building the temple, just as he gave plans to Moses for the tabernacle. However, David kept these plans for his son Solomon, as God had promised, would build the temple from David's line. So why is there all this new material about David? The author is certainly not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anyone can go and read about them in the books of Samuel. It seems instead that the author is trying to portray David as an ideal king in order to create a narrative that points to the image of the future messianic king. This idea becomes clearer when you read the story of God's covenant promise to David. The author of Chronicles definitively highlights the fact that neither David, Solomon, nor any of the kings from that line were the messianic king. But when that Messiah does come, he will be a king like the idealized David of these stories. For the author, these classic stories of David from the past are really glimpses into the future kingdom of God. Book of 2nd Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles chapter 1-36. Judah's kings and an unfinished story. As we continue into 2nd Chronicles, we find that the author has left out all the stories of the kings in northern Israel and instead focuses on the kings in southern Judah, which come from the line of David. The author specifically highlights those kings who were obedient to God and gained success and blessing. The author then talks about kings who were unfaithful to God. Those who failed to follow the Torah and led Israel into idol worship faced horrible consequences and ultimately brought about the Babylonian exile. And it was all a mess of their own making. The book's conclusion is unique. At the very end of the book, Cyrus, the king of Persia, tells the Israelites that they can return from exile and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He says, "Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." The book ends, it concludes with King Cyrus of Persia's decree allowing the exiled Israelites to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. The book's final words, about King Cyrus's edict, are often seen as an incomplete sentence, suggesting a future restoration of God's people and pointing to the coming of the Messiah. The author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly, in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. This incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. So, the book of Chronicles ends by pointing forward. What's the message of this book? They call upon God's people to look back, in order to look ahead, because the past is the source of hope for the future. And that's the end. Please join us for more Bible study.